All right. My name's Zhang. I'm a contributor and founding team member and the de facto mayor over at Friends with Benefits, which is a, thank you, which is a social token and a cultural meets crypto DAO. Over the last few months, a lot of people have been asking me for just different community design frameworks, or how do you build an online community? How do you build a DAO? Like, how do you really think about the structure and the framework to allow for sort of organic community development to occur? And as a resident non-crypto person who joined the crypto space 7-8 months ago, but from a background of community designing and urban planning and thinking about the way that cities and city design inform how people come together and interact, I thought the perfect sort of 10-minute presentation or walkthrough on urban planning as a community design framework would be interesting for some of the folks here, where hopefully many of you guys have DAO projects or individuals who contribute to different teams or protocols that you're on. And I hope that I can be of slight service to thinking about how you guys both manage your teams and your communities, but also allow for your communities to sort of really build organic activities and organic sort of accomplishments. And so I'll start with sort of sharing, I guess, a little bit of background on myself, which I think is helpful framing for this presentation and some of the work that I spend my time on. I've been a community builder and a designer for the last 7 years. I've run radio stations, I've run co-working spaces. The last company and community that I was at was called Summit Series, which was a global community company of about 20,000 members all around the world. And I became obsessed with how humans came together to work on shared goals to accomplish really, really big things. And that sort of Venn diagram with people from different backgrounds, when they sort of overlap, what are the things that they're able to sort of accomplish and work on together? Some of those accomplishments, you know, from some of those initiatives were gathering a community of 20,000 people to crowdfund and purchase a ski resort called Powder Mountain in Utah, where I spent the last 5-6 years living, helping build, thinking about the architecture of that ski town and how our community would sort of populate it. So now Friends with Benefits, which is a global community of about 2,000 active members from all over the world who hold a certain number of FwB, which is a liquid token that gets them access into a whole suite of different cultural experiences that the community creates. So everything from a token-gated Discord, all the way to token-gated parties and experiences and events, to content. The primary ethos is sort of how can we build the ultimate cultural membership as a DAO, where every contributor of that experience is able to create the content, own the content, and sort of distribute the content, was the experiment that was sort of started over a year ago. And so my hope here is to just kind of share some of these like basic frameworks for community development that have been really instrumental to like all these different parts of my journey, and specifically how Friends with Benefits started as like a token-gated Discord into now this really one of the leading sort of social tokens and DAO experiments in the space. And more importantly, how these basic frameworks, how these basic frameworks can be connected to an urban planning sort of modality or representation, because ultimately I think a lot of these DAOs and a lot of these digital spaces that we're building really look like internet cities, right? And really creating something that's grassroots and bottoms up, as opposed to, let's say, Web 2 corporations, where you have a founding team establishing explicit visions that everyone has to follow, as the most exciting companies or the most exciting communities really, really feel grassroots, with metrics that can be really tied back to how sort of cities or nations are planned, right? Things like GDP or per capita income or sovereign wealth fund metrics like citizen health, like these different sort of frameworks that can be employed when managing your digital community, but really makes sense when you compare it and contrast it to city development. So the first framework that was super helpful for me right when I joined Friends with Benefits and was really thinking about, okay, there's this giant Discord. There's like 300 members who are like super active and chatting in all these different spaces. What's next? How do we build together? What do we create on top of this sort of community to really allow for it to be focused? And one of the sort of key learnings that evolved was this framework of community building is gardening, not architecture. And so what I mean by that is community building is less about precisely measuring strategies and deploying strategies, more so identifying where there's natural sort of pockets or sort of convergences of interesting individuals who are collaborating in whatever unique capacity, and then nurturing those individuals or those subsets with resources, time, attention, distribution, whatever it might be, but really thinking about it as how do you see where natural things are growing, and how do you identify those individual pockets and sort of contribute resources to the organic growth of those structures. And so it was this interesting framing where it was a lot of like, if I were to ask you sort of, hey, like recreate a flower, right? You wouldn't molecule by molecule reconstruct and build that organic structure. You would water a seed, you would give it sort of different sets of resources, soil, sunlight, and then that flower that would eventually grow would look distinctly different from every single similar flower that you repeated that same habit, but ultimately would still be categorized as that same object. I think that's incredibly important because so many major protocols are like, how do we create a community like Friends with Benefits? How do we create a community like PartyDAO? How do we create a community like C Club? And it's ultimately like every single community will be distinctly different, but it's about, and it's not about trying to replicate it, it's more about trying to replicate the conditions that allowed for those individual humans to converge and create and build things together. And so it's sort of that mixture of both sort of shared context and belonging and serendipity and all of those like almost like variables, if you think about it scientifically, that then lead to a perfect combination that then allow for your, let's say, structure to blossom. So a lot more interesting and dynamic than traditional, let's say, planning, but more organic, like gardening. The second component is really designing for serendipity, which is something that I've thought a lot about in both organizing massive conferences, like festivals like this, all the way to thinking about when we purchased this ski resort town, a lot of the infrastructure wasn't quite built yet. We didn't have sewage or power or water or roads or sidewalks or any sort of communal infrastructure. And a lot of the, I think, North Star framing when thinking about building your online community or building your DAO is how do you design for organic serendipity where the strength of your community will really be defined by the one-on-one connections that your community members form. And so what does that mean? I think that's about designing for the right avenues or the right channels to allow for people who have shared interests and passions and roles and responsibilities to sort of collide, right? It's no different than Steve Jobs commissioning I.M. Pei to design his office, where he sort of centered the bathrooms in the middle of the office structure to allow for different employees across different disciplines to essentially cross paths, bump into each other, and sort of amplify those water cooler moments. I think it's incredibly important to think about those same structures in a digital context as well as a physical context. A great model to study is how parks are often designed, right? I went down a really deep park rabbit hole years ago and thinking about like what leads to really good architecture or constructions of public infrastructure, specifically like parks. And a lot of it, if you think about the best parks in the world, Central Park or some of the parks across Europe and in France and Italy, a lot of them are designed with sort of these main core focal points that allow for people to congregate and gather and view sort of public activity together. I think the biggest reason for that is to allow for serendipity. You run into people that you actually recognize, the shop owner from down the street, or a friend who might be going on a walk in that park as well. And I think that creates an intense sense of shared space and belonging that is incredibly important for any type of online community or physical community that you're trying to build. And so the second framework is really asking yourself as a community builder, how do you design for serendipity? How do you create the infrastructure or the channels or the opportunities for different members to collide and to spark individual relationships where, that's ultimately where the semi-autonomy or the autonomous, abbreviation in DAO comes from, I believe, is eventually having enough one-to-one connections that if you as the leader are able to step away for a period of time, there's enough trust and integrity and relationships built between your contributors or your community members that they're able to operate, at least for now, semi-autonomously. The third pillar is fractals, or what I like to sort of refer to in more of an urban context is neighborhoods. So fractals are sort of these self-generative repetitions that, upon macro view or micro view appear the exact same because they're symmetrical. And neighborhoods I think about in these internet cities we're building, right? These DAOs that we're creating, or these networks of thousands and thousands of contributors. To me, it's about the success of a DAO is really going to come down to the sort of interdependence and the interconnectedness between sub-organizations within your larger DAO framework that to me start to look like neighborhoods. And so these cities and these organizations, in my opinion, become incredibly resilient or as Nassim Taleb says, anti-fragile, when these individual parts that make up the whole are semi-autonomous, right? Or begin to define their own sets of culture or their own sets of norms and their own governing structures on the local level. So in a city analogy, you hang out in Bushwick or you hang out on the Upper East Side, two totally different sets of values, two totally different sort of, entry points, economic statuses, but it's the harmony of all these different neighborhoods that create an amazing city like New York. No different than at FwB, we have like crazy NFT trading channels, we've got trading crypto channels, we have like lifestyle channels where like skincare is one of our most popping neighborhoods. And the value of that to me is this sort of fusing of all these individual neighborhoods where some people are like, oh, yo, I only hang out in the lifestyle channels, or I only hang out in the, the NFT trading channels, which to me are no different than saying, oh yeah, Williamsburg's my neighborhood, I don't ever venture that side of the park, but it's about creating the public infrastructure where these neighborhoods are able to sort of intersect. So why is that important? Because in these communities, especially at the size in which a lot of these DAOs are scaling, the decision-making just becomes increasingly more slow. And the parent-level DAO organization just can't possibly make the most informed decisions for its constituents unless they're, sort of at the ground level, at the local level, in that specific fractal or in that specific neighborhood. And so I think more DAOs need to be thinking about how to design scalable, both wide but also in depth, governing structures and funding mechanisms to allow for these individual neighborhoods to sort of form, where great cities are really hundreds of different subcultures with sort of amorphous boundaries that become interesting mosaics that allow for the most dynamic communities to flourish. And then the final sort of framework in terms of operating a community or thinking about how governance or decision making is made is this notion of sort of representative democracy as opposed to direct democracy. And so this was an interesting learning that, I think DAOs at this stage, aren't 1,000 people making 1,000 decisions or even 1,000 people making one decision, but really 1,000 people electing a small group of individuals to make decisions on behalf of the group with the right sort of transparency mechanisms and re-election mechanisms and the frameworks to really delegate sort of compounding understanding, knowledge, information into a small group of individuals who then represent those specific, say, neighborhoods or that specific city. I think that's incredibly important because we see that right now we have this challenge in DAOs where everyone wants to contribute to like dozens and dozens of different DAOs. And so you end up either getting incredibly homogenous DAOs where everyone's sort of doing similar things and you lack specificity and expertise where individuals can really develop something custom to their native, say, population or their city sort of constituents. And so this framework of really thinking about how do you elect sort of representative democratic structures through voting mechanisms, through any sort of consensus alignment into trusted individuals where they're able to be held accountable by a community and not by, say, in trad structures, a board of directors, or just pure individualism, but really allowing a community to hold a group of elected representatives responsible and then empowering them with their decision making. So at FwB, even though right now a lot of our decision making is centralized to an extent where there's a group of about 40 contributors who are making decisions that have all been elected into those various roles, what we know is we can count on our community of 2,000 to promote and distribute and evangelize and use our products that we create for our community and to keep us sort of in a state of almost equilibrium in terms of ensuring that we're designing for our community as opposed to designing for, say, a small subset of individuals based on different sets of incentives. And so those sort of core frameworks of representative democracy, this concept of fractionalization through neighborhood design, as well as designing for serendipity, are sort of major umbrellas that have been really useful for me when thinking about how to harness what feels like thousands and thousands of different online pseudonyms and avatars, but turning them into an actual thriving and growing community that's able to focus on shared and agreed upon goals and accomplish rather spectacular things. Thank you.
We've got a couple of minutes for questions.
Hey, yeah, really love the talk, and I love the whole metaphor of like FwB as a city. But I was wondering, maybe you can just tell us a bit about where you think the metaphor ends. Like what are actually the clear differences in like a digital city and like a physical city, where you think actually there is a real difference? There's a differentiation point.
To repeat or summarize your question, the biggest differences between digital cities and sort of physical cities?
Yeah. So like, where does the metaphor end, and where does it stop being like useful actually? Because there are differences between the two.
Yeah, I think there's tons of things that are wrong with physical cities, right? So I don't think it's a direct, let's say, representation of explicitly how you should design your online community. I think it's more extracting urban design or urban or critical theory around cities and then remixing that or recontextualizing that for your online space. I think if you design too literally, you'll fall into a lot of the same, let's say, like even socioeconomic traps that cities have created or limitations that are bound by sort of the physicality of some of these cities. But I would say the biggest extraction is just pulling different theories that are the most resonant to how groups of people sort of organically and generate from the ground up. And then everything that falls outside of that box, up to your discretion on how you evaluate that. Yeah.
Hey, Alex. Can you hear me? Okay. I thought your point about like DAOs being like multiple flowers that regrow on the same patterns is really interesting in the context of this space, because I've noticed that most of the prominent DAOs are, as they get big, they're so sort of self-referential, and like they become incredibly complex, interesting organizations in themselves, but they're basically like islands that mostly just talk to themselves rather than talking to each other. And I'm very curious, in a sort of urban planning metaphor context, what you'd think about like DAOs interacting on common standards and starting to make like repeatable governance structures so that like DAOs have an easy way to interact with other DAOs, not just with itself as it gets more complex within. Does that make sense? Like a standard for DAOs to interact on an ecosystem level.
Yeah, I think, sorry, it was kind of hard to hear from back here, but I think that first part was resonant in that I think what's really exciting about this new, some of the new tools and technologies that have really developed and make the ability for competitiveness between DAOs to be lubricated is really like the new sort of the uprising of NFTs and token design, where for the first time you're able to see parallel economies and frameworks run together as opposed to being competitive by nature, like a lot of how social media was dominated in Web 2, where it was all fighting over data and usage in terms of those individual users and locking them into those specific platforms. I think in Web 3 frameworks, or let's say digital city frameworks, there's reasons why these cities are able to actually cooperate together under larger frameworks, let's say federal level and state level and municipal level. And I think there's so much to explore around two-token models or token swap models that allow for other DAOs who come to FwB and say they want to build a similar product. It allows us to actually engage in a conversation like, hey, what does it look like to invest in you guys as a DAO and sort of swap tokens so our incentives are aligned, or to even create a new token and FwB to sort of provide the liquidity in the formation of a new entity so that we're now all both socially aligned and financially aligned, which I think in a traditional structure of, say, doing like equity swaps gets incredibly messy, because it's like, how is that governance controlled? How does that look like and extrapolate over many years? When in a token world, and because of just the inherent sort of transparency that Web3 sort of calls for, makes it a lot easier for a, sort of a positive sum abundance framework as opposed to an inherently zero-sum competitive framework.
Any more questions for Alex?
John up here.
Yeah, I think it's amazing that you guys have been able to scale the number of people contributing to the DAO, and that Fractals analogy is really nice. How did you today? What's the process, and how did you start dealing with abundant desire to contribute when maybe not every not every idea is worth building a team around, and also it's hard to add a bunch of new contributors at once. So what's the process for making sense of thousands of people all raising their hand and being oh, I have an idea, I want to do this thing? How do you then eventually end up with effective teams that are building stuff for FwB?
Yeah, 100%. I think anyone who's leading a lot of these really sort of top-notch DAOs, Jess Sloss from Seed Club or John Palmer asked that question from Party DAO. We're all, I assume, in the same challenge where there's an overabundance of people who want to contribute, but not enough clear, explicit opportunities, which end up becoming kind of wastes of resources to an extent where you want to utilize them. You can't, it's that sort of delicate balance of how much you delegate that's too much, and then it becomes a problem. I think there's two things. I think one, on the fractal analogy, I think the key to scaling contributors and DAOs is this cascading nested sub-DAO infrastructure that allows for you to actually deploy resources, governance, and decision-making into smaller groups that then can fit into a sort of a quadrant that I've just designed on a napkin or whatever of for me, I use when I lead teams, there's a matrix of important, non-important, and then reversible and irreversible. So if something falls into a category of reversible and non-important, I'm almost very easily delegate, go give it a shot, and call me in 2 weeks if it blows up. And then you can easily see how if it's, let's take the other extreme, if it's irreversible and it's important, then to me that's okay, let's get all of the different key thinkers in a room and let's really think through this and give it time. And then I think it's being generous with giving people opportunities as long as they fall into those different categories. And so ultimately, I think with sort of an importance framework and then in a reversibility framework plus establishing sub-DAOs and sub-networks to allow for that experimentation to occur. Right now, FwB is reaching a point where our activity on the Discord is far surpassing what's even manageable, and we're experimenting in probably the next month with launching sort of 2 major sub-DAOs, which will have a token swap infrastructure and allow for the NFT channel to essentially become its own NFT DAO, all using the same FwB token, but creating their own new market with its own new priorities and initiatives, such as buying assets, syndicating and allowing for group, peer-led investing mechanisms, educating and helping artists launch their first NFTs. All of that, there's no way I would be able to design the perfect infrastructure for that, but the 200 contributors inside of the FwB NFT channel who have been active in NFTs for the last 6 months to a year are way more equipped than I am. It's just my role to sort of pass on the framework to allow for that neighborhood to become established.